Arav, no, 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 Arav, no. Good afternoon and welcome to the Thought Leadership session on designing DEI measures for strategic alignment and accountability. My name is Smita and I lead the DEI vertical at Interweave. In today's session, we will focus about why it is important to have a DEI measurement framework that is integrated to manage the efforts effectively. So, to talk about this, we have Pothan Jacob. Pothan, welcome. Pothan is a partner and principal consultant with Interweave. And before I hand it over to Pothan, I'm sorry. Before I hand it over to Pothan, some pointers for our audience. There is a closed caption or a CC option available. Please use as required. And for any queries or feedback, please write to Mira at interweave.in. With that, I hand it over to Pothan.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can all hear me clearly. Uh, Before we get into the topic that we're going to discuss today, I just wanted to make sure that we have few fundamentals that we would discuss, and then get into a framework that we could use for measuring diversity, equity, and inclusion in organizations. So, Mitch, if you could bring up the presentation. So what I'm going to do is, before getting into the framework, I'm going to talk about a bit about measurements and then about strategic alignment and accountability, and how do we ensure that we have both foundations clearly understood before we get into a potential or an example of creating a foundation and a framework for measuring DEI in organization. So if you move to the next slide. So I'm going to look at measurements in two different dimensions and different types of measurements in two different dimensions. The first one is the level of intelligence. The level of intelligence is basically we are looking at what kind of uh, potential or what how do we use these measures potentially in an organization. It can actually get into different aspects and different frames. So one of the frame is look at it. Are we looking at a measure which is of unidimension, or are we looking at a measure which is an integration of multiple different measures coming together to make a composite measure? So that's a level of intelligence. You're actually making it into a complex metric rather than a simple metric, which is basically looking at one dimension or one factor. The other dimension that I would look at in terms of intelligence is are we measuring something which has already been done and already it's a post facto measure that we are reporting back on what has happened? Or are we looking at a measure which will help us to forecast what will happen in the future? And we'll get into lead and lag measures a bit in some time. So that are the two dimension or two different ends of the spectrum in terms of the level of intelligence. Now, from a strategic advantage perspective, we could have measures which are tactical, operational on one end of the spectrum, which talks about what is happening, how it's happening, etc. To the other end of the spectrum, we could have measures which are strategic in nature, which helps us to make choices and decisions. So that's the spectrum that we would look at on the strategic advantage dimension or axis, where whether if the measures are helping us to operationally manage what we are doing or helping us to take some decisions with respect to what and how we should progress or proceed with what we are doing in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, let me now take you through the different measurements which would actually move from one end of the spectrum in both the axes. So first one I'm going to look at is reporting. Reporting is basically looking at something which has already happened, like for example, gender representation or attrition of gender, etc. All comes under the broad framework of reporting. It's all things which has happened and we cannot do anything about it. It's just monitoring what has already happened and we are reporting back on what's the current state of that particular metric or that particular situation today. Whereas if we move towards the right to the next level, we are deep diving into that particular metric to understand where it's happening. For example, if we were to look at attrition by level or attrition by function, we are actually trying to see, okay, I know that attrition is happening, but which part of the organization is contributing to this particular attrition, attrition of diversity representation, and what is the point that, or what is the area that I need to focus on in terms of where it's been localized. The third level, we are actually getting into the statistical analysis part of it. Why is it happening? Why is attrition happening in the organization? Attrition of diversity uh, representation in organization. Why is it happening? So here we are moving from a deep dive of a unidimensional metrics into factors which would contribute to the attrition in an organization. For example, if I were to look at attrition, we get deeper into this when we get into the framework. What are the control factors? What are the contributing factors to attrition? I'm just taking attrition as an example. Don't take that as the only thing that we're looking at, or looking at what are the contributing factors which helps us to progress people within the organization. So this could be all different examples where we can actually go down and see how each of these matrices contribute to the larger objectives that we want to drive within the organization, which drives the strategic objectives. So it's going to be a little more of causal relationship, or multiple factors helping us to understand why a uh, particular outcome that we're getting in organization. Um, if we move to the next level of complexity in terms of strategic advantage and intelligence, it's predictive. Predictive, it's not very easy to look at predictive modeling because we need to start looking at causal relationships that we need to build, the statistical validity of it, the statistical contribution that each of the factors. So we identified why is it happening, the factors. Now we are actually giving weightages to those factors, so that we know that each of the factors certain level of contribution that will eventually help or result in a particular outcome. And if we were to manage those, we will be able to get to a particular outcome if we were to look at certain contributing factors moving in a particular dimension. So for example, if I were to look at uh, the pipeline strength of or the pipeline strength of sourcing as one of the factors which helps us to predict what could be the potential hiring rate of diversity talent. If I know what's the level of contribution that has at the beginning of the, or the at one end of the pipeline, like which is sourcing, I can clearly say that, okay, the sourcing strength is increasing by 5% increase in terms of number of resumes that I'm getting, which will lead to X percentage of increase uh, in overall representation or selection at the end of it, which can lead to the number of people being hired. So it's basically building a factorial weightage to it for each of those measures, which could help us to understand what would be the outcome. Last one is optimization. I will take an example at a later stage what optimization means. It's looking at multiple factors coming together and what is a maximization metric that we would build, or maximization program or algorithm that we would build in order to understand what would be the best and the most optimal way by which we need to manage each of these factors to get to a particular outcome. So each one of these, we need to actually look at the maturity curve of in each of the organization in terms of what level of matrices we can build with respect to being simple reporting metric to an optimization framework that we could actually generate or develop for an organization. Now, I've classified these metrics into two different segments. One is lag, and the other one is lead. Lag measures are all the measures which would help us understand what has already happened. Whereas the lead measures are the ones which would gives us the ability to get to make choices which will help us to actually drive the diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in a particular direction. So it is more in terms of what could lead to certain outcomes rather than what has already happened. So that's a primary consideration in terms of what type of measures that we would look at in terms of what is the objective with which we build a framework for DEI, both all in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion measures that we would build. If we could move to the next slide, what we're going to look at is, how do we build the strategic alignment that we need to achieve in organization? um, and how do we ensure that the strategic alignment is also leading to some certain level of accountability? And most of us know about the term line of sight, and I'll come to that as when we talk about accountability. I'll talk about how do you build that line of sight for each of the roles which contributes to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the organization. But let's start with purpose. Purpose by itself, we talk about purpose is primarily our objective. What is a business imperative with which we're going to address diversity, equity, and inclusion? Because unless we connect ourselves to the strategic imperatives of the organization, it's very difficult to drive the traction within the organization. So we need to create that business imperative. Why and what if we don't do it? What are the challenges that we would have if we don't do those, if we don't take those actions which drives diversity, DEI in organization? Now, that's a very high level goal and high level statement, rather, not even a goal. We need to then break it down to what are those strategic objectives which helps us to achieve those business imperative or the value creation imperatives. In our context, it's more of the value creation imperatives. And when we break it down into strategic objectives, that's when we really look at what is the actionable initiatives that can go along with each of these strategic objectives, which get translated into how we're going to get this done, how we're going to operationalize each of these strategic objectives in an organization, which will lead to the outcomes that we want to achieve in each of the strategic objectives, thus leading us to achieve the purpose and the strategy with which we have started and driving the value creation in an organization. Now, all these will belong to the roadmap or the charter of the organization. But now we need to actually take those charter, the strategic objectives and initiatives in the charter, and start looking at what measures would help us to understand whether we are in the right direction or do we need to take any course correction. So those are the last two segments which I have, which is measures and decisions. The measures are the ones which help us to understand whether if we were to achieve the strategic objectives and if we were to set certain targets for each of those measures, where are we today and how are we achieving those objectives, which are achieving those targets we've set, and which are related to a particular strategic objective, and how far are we from the targets that we set, and what do we need to do in order to make those change, what changes do we need to make in order to get to those strategic objectives, and what are the different course corrections we need to make. And that actually helps. All those measures will help us in terms of taking decisions which are operational in nature, helping us to lead to the strategic objectives that we need to achieve in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, let's understand how this builds the accountability in organization. So if we were to look at the last part of it, the decision making, the line of sight that we're creating, with respect to measurements and how these measurements get translated into our ability to achieve the initiatives. That's where the line of sight, which will help us to actually build that connect between the strategic objectives and actions that we take on the ground by each of the individuals in an organization or each of the roles in an organization. Um, Now, let's move to how does this happen with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion in an organization. And I've taken it as an example in order to help understand what this means when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So if we were to move to the next slide, we are going to look at a very simple example. I wouldn't call it simple, but no, but I will try to keep it as simple as possible. Now, here's what I have here is a framework, which is going to be, I'm going to look at it from, let me start from the purpose. The purpose of the organization is to make or build of uh, or develop or achieve an organizational culture which is equitable and inclusive, which furthers diversity. So let's take that as a purpose of the organization. And now, what is a tangible outcome that we have to drive? Now, if I were to look at the tangible outcome is diversity. But diversity is driven by equity and inclusion and sustained by equity and inclusion. To start with, what I would look at is the internal labor market. So the triangle that you see in the middle is what I'm representing as the internal labor market. Internal labor market has three different aspects to it. One, we're going to take talent from outside. We're going to fill talent from outside, diversity talent from outside through hiring. At the same time, we lose talent to the market through attrition. So there is pipeline of people coming in from outside, and there is loss of talent which is moving out of the organization into the market. But at the same time, if you were to look at that deeper inside, there is also talent moving within, which is progressing from the lower levels to the higher levels in the organization. So there is a certain amount of mechanics which is there between these three aspects that we need to look at when it comes to diversity measurement. Or now here looking at the strategic objective of increasing diversity in the organization. Now let's look at what are these factors which will actually look at. If I were to look at, there is a higher level of fulfillment. I know that there is diversity representation increasing from external uh, external hiring which is happening. Now, if I were to able to contain that within the organization with respect to lower levels of attrition, I know that the amount of hiring which I need to have from outside can be much lower than what I can progress people from within. So if I were to look at a particular level, like let's look at middle management. If I were to look at the middle management, I want to increase the representation by 5%. So I'm going to look at what is, if my attrition is at a lower level, the ability that I have to fulfill those requirements from within becomes much higher. So there is an interrelationship between what needs to be brought from outside and what can be developed from within. So if the overall change has to happen from the 5% increase in terms of middle management, the representation of the middle management, I may not have to look at the external channels as much as I would look at it from the internal pipeline that I have, which is coming from the lower levels representing. So you are going to look at it from the perspective that, okay, what is the kind of measurement that I would look at from external hiring? The overall hiring conversion that I would have with respect to people from diversity segment, and look at what is the percentage of conversion that I would have with respect to developing people internally uh, from the investment that I'm making internally, which converts people to accelerate, or which helps people to accelerate their career progression within the organization. At the same time, if I were to look at what's the rate at which I'm losing people to the external market, what is that I need to look at in terms of that factor, that metric, which helps me control those factors in terms of attrition of diversity segment. Now, we talked about building initiatives and factors which are helping us to understand what contributes to each one of it. So now let's look at one example in terms of hiring from outside. Uh, if I were to look at hiring from outside and getting people or getting diversity talent from outside, there are multiple factors that I would look at in order to understand the relationship between different matrices which could contribute to that factor of or total fulfillment rate of diversity segment. One of the factors which I could look, and this is not complete, or this is not the uh, the larger set of all inclusive, but three things which I've taken in terms of the different factors that would help me to understand the fulfillment rate. The first one is diversity sourcing rate. What is a percentage of resumes we get which is from a particular diversity segment as compared to total number of resumes that I would have for a particular role, for a particular function, or overall as an organization. That's one of the factors and one of the matrices that would help me to understand what would be the future fulfillment rate for, or one of the factors which would help me predict the fulfillment rate that would help me increase the diversity representation in the organization. Now let's look at the second factor, which is the selection rate. The selection rate is what if I were to increase, assume that I'm going to increase the sourcing rate, but what percentage of those candidates, diversity candidates, are going to get converted into employees or onboarded employees in the organization. There could be multiple factors, but I'm talking about just the metric, which is going to help me understand the the relationship between the sourcing rate and the selection rate, which could also then be built further into what are the other factors contributing to the selection rate, etc., which will come to it later. Now, first of all, is understanding the selection rate, which helps me understand what is the level of conversion. If I were to increase the sourcing rate from 5% to 10%, my selection rate, which was earlier 7%, has moved to 12%. So we are actually building both these matrices to understand what could be the end fulfillment rate that I would have. But I've also looked at one more factor which could also help us to actually predict the potential fulfillment rate or the overall representation, which is the early mortality rate. In many places, we would bring in people, but we may lose those people in the first 6 months or first 12 months. And from a diversity perspective, how many of those people are we losing in the first 6 months and the first 12 months? And our ability to track and monitor those and then take actions which would help us to reduce those factors or negative factors which would lead into the more early mortality in organization. That's one side of it, which basically looks at the fulfillment part of it. Now let's look at the exit or the attrition side of measurement. Uh, while the primary measurement is diversity attrition, but that doesn't help us to understand why it's happening. Like we talked about the measurement, what to why. The first thing we would do is drill down in terms of where is it happening, which are the areas that we need to look at in terms of different functions, different levels, etc. But that is not really a contributing factor. It's only an uh, exploratory exercise that we're doing where we need to address in terms of which part of the organization we need to address. But if you were to look at attrition, we need to primarily go down the path of what's the level of inclusion and equity in the organization, where equity could be two parts of equity. One is systemic part and the other one perceived equity. Whereas inclusion is mostly about behaviors and measures of behaviors, which could be which could be measured through different instruments that we could develop. The equity part, let me first focus on the equity part. Equity is looking at each of the policies and seeing whether there is lack of equity and what's the extent to which that policies are driving equity within the organization. It could be one how equity is established in each of the policy or the policies that you have internally in the organization. The other one is in terms of external benchmarking, to what extent are we with respect to being competitive with respect to the market, and how are we measuring with respect to those level of maturity and progressive practices that we're adopting within the organization. That's a systemic part of it. The second part of it is a perceived part of it. Well, we could put all these systemic changes, or we could bring about all these systemic changes in the organization, but how is it perceived by the employees? How is it received by the employees? That needs to be more of instrument based approach in terms of understanding how these behaviors how these changes are perceived and accepted and received by employees, and what are the changes that you could further make. And sometimes it may not be even changes. Sometimes it could be communication that we could do with employees in terms of helping them understand the purpose with which we have made those changes. Inclusion is purely behavior driven. So we talk about engagement surveys, it's very similar to that. The measurement of inclusion is very similar to like that of an engagement survey. But I'm not a great proponent of how those instruments are designed today. There are better ways of designing those instruments, which helps us to understand and make it more actionable for us to look at what changes can be brought in terms of behaviors and the way employees experience interpersonal relationships within the organization, informational transparency, etc. The last one is about the one which is mostly not being looked at by most of the organization, which is the development part of it. The development part has got a few dimensions in terms of how we can actually build those factors of measurement, which helps us understand how we are progressing people and what rate at which we could progress people or we will progress people into the future. So one element or one metric which I've looked at is developmental opportunity. How much of development opportunity is going to specifically to certain segments that we need to progress faster or accelerate within the organization, and what is the disproportionate investment that we are making in order to make that acceleration. The second one is the learning penetration. How much of that is penetrating, how much of the learning is penetrating across different levels within the organization, and making sure that the investment is distributed in a way that it is broadly addressing uh, all resources or all talent which is across multiple levels, so that the progression is not just focused at one particular part of the organization or one particular level of the organization. And lastly, what is the talent readiness? We are doing all this investment to make sure that there is accelerated talent available, accelerated diversity talent available within the organization. Now, can we measure that by looking at how soon are they getting ready to progress to the next level? We all have our ways of hypo identification, acceleration, all those things, 9 box. But are we looking at specifically with respect to representation? Sorry, are we looking at it very specifically with respect to diversity and tracking that specifically to diversity in terms of how is it relatively progressing with respect to the rest of the organization, rest of the other segments that we have, and what is the differential acceleration that we're giving to talent in the organization to make it further or accelerate faster. Lastly, I'll take a uh, quick explanation of how we should look at measurements being established in the organization. If you move to the next slide, Mitch. Now, we talked about all these things, but how do I put it together in an organization? How do I operationalize this in an organization that I'm in? Uh, First thing is looking at the strategic objectives that we have, which is derived from the charter, from the DI charter. How do I convert that into high level objectives, which will help me drive my objectives, drive my purpose, drive my vision for the organization? Now, once we have that, like the way I've explained it in the previous slide, we need to start looking at what factors influence those objectives. uh, don't look at too many of it. Make sure that we have enough which critically which where we can where we can build the causal relationship between the objectives and the factors which could actually bring about that change, bring about that movement for that particular strategic objectives. The third element is, if you were to look at those objectives, what are the critical measures which will help me understand each of the factors which influence the strategic objective? Now, here's one place we need to be very careful that we don't get into creating 15 different matrices. It's not going to help. As much as possible, create composite matrices which helps us understand and help us take decisions and corrective measures. Lastly, if we were to look at operationalizing those measures, one of the critical challenges many organizations face is the availability of data to consistently report those ones. Do not get into a space where you're establishing a measure and you're spending enormous amount of time trying to report that. Keep it simple. Try to use proxy or direct measures or direct uh, direct data which is available, currently available, rather than creating a lot of things, so that you can actually report back. It may not be 100% accurate. It need not be 100% accurate. It's directional. It many a times we try to go for accuracy and then lose the plot in terms of how we're going to actually look at these measures helping us to achieve the objectives. So that's the last one, making sure that there is a methodology and a process defined to understand the availability of data and the use of data, and consistently reporting it back in a periodic manner, so that we know that the progress, where we're making progress, where we're not making progress, and what actions do we need to take in order to course correct and change the direction if need be. So that's where I'm going to stop, and then look at and Smita. Yes.
Thanks, Potan. That's quite comprehensive, I must say. I had a few questions that I had in mind, but before that, there is a question from one of our participants. In your deck, especially the slide on alignment and accountability, you spoke about purpose. So we have a question here that asks you, can you give an example of a purpose statement?
So I think I tried to bring about one of the purpose statement, like create an environment of equity and inclusion to further diversity within the organization. That could be one of the purpose statement. It could be another one. Could be uh, uh, drive establishing inclusion and include establish an inclusive workplace which drives innovation through multiple perspectives. Could be another purpose statement. So it could be different for different organizations how they want to define it. It's not about a metric, it's about a direction. Or it could be a workplace where people feel included and belonged. Could be a purpose statement. It's a high level directional statement which helps you set the North Star and drive the rest of the initiatives to align itself to that North Star.
All right. So, Preeti, I hope that answers your question. So, Potan, while setting the metrics and being able to manage and monitor your DI efforts is quite aspirational. Most of the organizations have started talking to us about it. There are still, this large sector of organization, even the large global MNCs, that are starting, if I may say, at level zero or level one in their DI journey. For them, designing this entire metrics and calculating the DE and I of the journey can be quite overwhelming. So, is there any simple measures, or if I might say, quick wins that they can start off with?
Yeah. So I would look at direct measures to start with. Than the factors contributing to those direct measures as the first level of first level of maturity in terms of measures. And even there, uh, I would rather look at the first two aspects: the input and the exit, the attraction and retention part of it, even before I get into the developmental aspect of it. And many organizations may not have the data framework which is required to support some of those developmental matrices that you want to track. And many may have with all the ERPs which are available right now. But primarily start with direct measures. And as we mature, let's get into the control measures or the contributing factors, which will help us to understand why is it happening rather than what's happening. So that's a journey that I would take. First, look at what is happening, and then look at why it's happening. Before we get into the more mature ones, can move then further move into what can I control and how I need to control the different factors to achieve certain outcomes, which is the final or the last or the highest level of maturity, even before we get into optimization part.
So while in our own jobs that we do, D&E is easy to measure. Measuring inclusion has always been the elephant in the room. So how do you really understand if the needle has moved on employee experience or a perception of fairness and belonging when you really can't quantify it? You can't say that, yes, the needle has moved significantly from what it was last year. We run ESAT surveys, there is perception surveys run, but the responses from that are often very dispersed and diluted. So, is there any, method or a system that organizations can look at to actually track the progress?
So that's a very what do you call it's a very complex space to get into. Let me qualify that, and it needs a few perspectives we need to take into account. One is the perceptional aspects of it. What is the perceived equity and perceived inclusion, which is mostly uh, driven through surveys and instruments that we could deploy. But here again, are we going to look at a generic instrument, or are we going to look at, I always talk about moments of truth from marketing, or moments of critical experiences that employees go through in their employee life cycle within an organization. Can we be more specific in terms of how they felt included, and what is the feeling of equitable decisions that we have made at each of those points, rather than looking at a one time, once in 2 years kind of assessment of it? That makes it more reliable as a measure in terms of understanding the perception. The second aspect which I would look at is, I've mentioned earlier as well that I'm not a very big fan of Likert scale, because particularly in India, which I've done syndicated studies, one thing which I've realized is that, no, it's more of an uh, emotional response that we get than a rational response to each of those questions. So, can we look at instruments which are more anchored? What I mean by that is asking people to respond to different statements rather than looking at one statement and a scale of agree to dis, mostly disagree to completely agree kind of thing. That 5 point scale, which doesn't really people don't apply their minds when they respond to those. But if you were
True.
to convert it into more uh, anchored responses, that they need to actually read through each of those statements, and uh, then respond to a statement which brings out the feelings of those of the people, depending upon the actions that they've experienced, would make it a lot more reliable and a lot more actionable in the context. That's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it, how is it converting into decision equity that we have? For example, if I were to look at, we have conducted or we have gone through a performance rating process. Now, how much are we going into that data and understand the equitable or equity or lack of equity that we had in terms of the decision outcomes that we made? That could help us to actually align or calibrate it with respect to responses that we got, with respect which we collect from the survey instruments that we have. So it has to be read together. And thirdly, don't stop there. If you were to look at certain things, understand why it's happening. Is it a policy or a systemic driven challenge that we're going to have, or is it driven by behavior of people, and not by systemic policies that we have within the organization, so that we know we are root causing it down to what do we need to do in order to address and change. Now, once we have those root causing done, if you have taken some actions, measure it again. For example, if I've taken an action in terms of a policy change, how are we going to understand the impact of that policy change? Think about measuring it at the time of designing or at the time of implementing that policy change itself, and don't leave it to chances that no, later I will understand how it's overall contributed to it. Be specific in terms of understanding and measuring and understanding changes as a result of certain interventions that you've done. That makes it more causal and reliable in order to make those changes, or in order to understand how much of contribution it had towards the overall change in equity and inclusion that we've brought about in an organization.
So I have a few more questions, but just before that, I'm conscious of the comments by the audience. So we have a particular question that says the purpose statement has to align with the organization's vision. Is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, it doesn't resonate with employees, or it doesn't have uh, the uh, the ability to sustain itself if we don't. At the end of it, we are all looking at what is the strategic alignment that we have with respect to purpose statements that we build for DEI, and what is the business imperative with which we're going to drive each of these things within the organization. It may not be as explicit in the purpose statement, but it needs to be explained within the organization. Why are we doing it? What is a business imperative? What is a social imperative? Both are important. We cannot just rely on, and social imperatives are equally important as much as a business imperative in today's context. So it's both.
Okay, so we've increasingly seen ERGs move from being affinity groups to being business resource groups now. So there is a certain ROI that ERGs also have, ERGs being measured as well. So when we look at designing the measurement framework, does ERG have a prominent role to play, or does it lie only with the DI council or the business leaders?
I would say ERG has a very large role to play with respect to measurements. Measurement of effectiveness of certain policies, practices, and initiatives that we drive, which is directly impacting certain segments of the population, of the employees within the organization. So it's important for us to understand. And ERGs, I would assume that they are more closely uh, related to closely working with respect to implementation of these initiatives. To that extent, operational understanding of operational effectiveness of the initiatives, ERGs play a very significant role. They are close to those employee segments that they represent, that they align to. They're very close to the perceptions and feelings of people in those employee segments. So to that extent, absolutely, yes, they play a vital role in terms of measurement and making it effective for the segments that they represent.
We also have a question from Nazia Maiman. She was saying that I'm attempting to make a gender diversity index. Can you share your thoughts on building a gender diversity index?
That's a loaded question. Thank you, because gender diversity index has got multiple aspects to it. One is in terms of the direct measures that you would look at, in terms of how is representation increasing, how is attrition reducing, how is the development of people, uh, gender diverse people, progressing within the organization. I would look at these as the direct matrices, which would directly uh, contribute to certain percentage of weightage. So I'm just looking at it from index now. We want a composite. Just give me a minute. So that's one aspect of it, in terms of the direct measures that helps us understand the outcome. And the second aspect is basically looking at the equity part of it. Now, equity has got two parts, like I defined earlier. One is adoption of policies by people from a certain gender or specific gender, which are primarily targeted to be utilized by that gender. For example, if I were to look at um, if I were to look at certain kind of leaf that we have, which is specifically targeted at, like, for example, people who are adopting children, and getting that leaf, and having a leaf for adoption, what percentage of people are using it? I mean, first of all, they have to get into the adoption, and then are they utilizing it to its fullest extent? Now, let me also try to explain why is it important. always it's not about making it available to people, but also making them comfortable to avail that leave, because a lot of fears which could be there that no, I mean, even if it's available, I may not want to use it. So do we have those dynamics playing out in organization, understanding what level of utilization do we have? Or a better example will be work from home, and many organizations I know that they've implemented a policy of work from home, but the utilization has been very low because there are certain behavioral manager behaviors which are not facilitating that particular policy to be used and utilized by people who require that flexibility in an organization. So that is one aspect of it in terms of representation and in terms of utilization from an equitable or a policy which accommodates certain needs of people, and particularly now we're talking about gender. That's not enough. We also need to understand how those policies are perceived. So it's important to create another instrument which would help us to understand perceptions about these policies in general, not may not be very specific to each of those policies, but overall understanding of how those policies are perceived as a benefit, or as a, I wouldn't call benefit, as an accommodation which facilitating gender diversity within the organization. Now, we talked about direct measures of diversity, we talked about equity measures of diversity, and how we could actually look at two aspects of it. One is the systemic utilization of certain policies, and second one is the instrument which helps us to understand perception about equity. And then last one is inclusiveness. Don't go overboard by developing a generic inclusion instrument. In this case, I would very specifically look at what would be an instrument which captures the most critical inclusion measures, inclusion factors, and make it very specific to understand how gender experiences inclusion in organization. And if I were to take all these three, weight it in a way that, no, that's where it becomes tricky. What should be the weightage that I should give? Should I weight all these 4 or 5 or 6 things equally? Or would one have higher weightage than the other one? That's a little bit of a, I mean, we will not be able to get into statistical modeling and all those stuff to understand that, no, factor loading and all those stuff. But we need to start with with certain level of gut in order to look at what factor weightage I would give for each of those matrices. That's how I build an index for diversity or inclusion or DI for diversity, equity, and inclusion index for gender. I hope that it's a little complex, but I thought I
Yeah.
could. I'm trying to make it as simple as possible with respect to each of these factors in that
Yeah, the
perspective.
question is quite complex. We can just about scratch the surface. At least in this session, it will require a lot more deliberation. We have another question that says the most linear and basic KPI picked up is the gender ratio. How do we ensure that it does not become a pity case for female employees?
So that's I wouldn't call that measure being a pity case, but I would call it, I would at the same time qualify that as more of how uh, how it's received by organized internal employees, which creates that feeling of pity case. um, that's why I was talking about, inclusion. I mean, in one of the articles which I'm writing, I'm talking about, are we looking at metrics driving equity and inclusion, and the reason to why we should have equity and inclusion as a proactive thought, or are we looking at metrics being driven by metrics driving this equity and inclusion as a reactive thought? That's where it becomes more of a pity case, when it becomes a reactive thought. If we were to look at equity and inclusion as a proactive thought and diversity following it, very often it doesn't lead to a pity case. That's the way I could best put it across. So it's not about a particular metric being driving it, but how that metric is being used and how that metric is being driven in an organization, which leads to that case, a pity case, in most of the organizations.
So, Pothan, you spoke about the causal relationship, right? So, the causal relationship between the DI impact and the business outcome is often not very visible. This being the case, as DI councils or champions, how do you really present the case to a management that's curious to know what's the ROI? It's also related to a recent discussion we had where, we were asked what's the ROI. So, how do you go about helping councils present this case?
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure most of us come from the HR fraternity and background, at least some of us. Uh, it's not very easy to build a it's I would say, okay, let me put it this way. It is not difficult to build a business case. uh, and there is a big difference between a business case and a financial justification. We need to differentiate between the two. A business case is sometimes a business case may not even have a financial justification to it. For example, if I were to increase the engagement, I can build a financial justification to it, but it's far and it's a long shot. Can I isolate the contribution of certain actions that I do, and specifically look at what kind of financial contribution it has towards retention, attraction, and all the stuff? It's like, yes, you can, but it's you spend more time trying to justify that than getting any benefit out of it. But if I were to look at engagement and attraction, retention, and I'm taking this as an example to help understand what we should be doing in DAI as well, that's where we actually can help build a business case for driving engagement within the organization. Similarly, if I were to look at inclusion, why should I drive inclusion within the organization? We all know that it contributes to higher levels of retention, better branding as an organization, and leads to higher levels of productivity. But are we going to convert that into a financial outcome that we want to show, so that every investment that can be justified in that space? I wouldn't take that as as an objective in terms of, but I would certainly look at how it's translating into uh, how people feel about working in an organization, how people feel valued working in an organization, how will people get feel belonged in an organization, what's the psychologically safety with which that they operate or that we work in a particular place. All that are factors which indirectly contribute to financial outcomes, which may be too difficult to ascertain what is that specific contribution that we're making financially.
It's so the last thanks, Nazia. The last question I have, and also considering that you've done a lot of work in this area, and that's pay equity and pay parity. There's a lot of discussions in forums about pay parity or pay equity, but very little work, or there's discomfort with presenting the report on this. Is there any specific measures that organizations can take to report pay equity, or anything around that? Why is it still the big elephant in the room?
Yeah, it's a it's a bit of a, what do you call, chicken and egg situation. If we ask any organization, is your pay equitable, they'll all say yes. But can we deep dive into it? They say no, 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 we all know about it. So that's a chicken and egg situation that I've got into in many cases, in many situations. It's about what's our understanding of pay equity. Pay equity is not something where we just look at the central measures or central tendency measures and say, yeah, mean salary of men and women are very close to each other. Yeah, we are equitable. But that doesn't help us in terms of understanding the pay equity across an organization. The first and fundamental thing about pay equity is creating homogeneous groups for which you can measure that central tendency, and also distribution of that particular the distribution statistics in terms of, like, standard deviation, variance, etc. So both put together is actually helping us to
If I may
understand.
just interject, Motan, when you said homogeneous group, can you give us an example, if you will? What sort
So
of groups should you create?
there are two ways of creating a homogeneous group. One is statistically looking at. I'm not getting into that. It's like clustering. and looking at k-mean clusters and looking at different bits. I'm not getting it. Like, for example, if I were to look at it from a manual way of creating a homogeneous group, like, are we looking at different demographic classification of people before we start looking at mean salaries of those people? For example, grades, functions, location, um, tenure within the organization, overall experience. So we are actually narrowing it down to specifically down to higher levels of homogeneity when you have intersections of all these demographics coming to play. Um, uh, Employees in a particular function at a grade level, operating in a particular geographic area, and with tenure between 5 to 10 years, that becomes an homogeneous or close to homogeneous kind of segment. And then understanding, is there any differences between the salaries of those people? Now then we are looking at what's the central tendency measures, like mean median mode, or basically mean median, and then looking at what's the kind of dispersion in terms of the standard deviation and variance in that particular. Is there any kind of skewness in that data? All those things are measures that we look at with respect to dispersion, understanding the dispersion of that data, or the distribution of that data. We could also get into a little bit of statistical analysis in terms of how, if I were to look at, particularly if I were to look at a data segment in terms of people, let's create a homogeneous class of a level, a family, job family, and a particular level of performance. Now I want to look at, if people have spent different tenure in that particular grade, can I look at what percentage of people, what's the distribution of people with respect to 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 1 to 2, 0 to 1 year, 1 to 2 years, 2 to 3 years, 3 to 4 years, or 4 to 5 years and above? What is the distribution looking like? And what is the difference in distribution? For example, pay equity with respect to male and female. What is there a difference between the way in which the percentage distribution is distributed between these subclasses? Then it becomes more decision supporting, and then we can talk about what actions to be taken in order to correct some of those inequities that exist within the organization. So that's what I meant by pay equity is not just about looking at the overall mean median of pay. It's much more deeper in terms of causal analysis, in terms of in investigative analysis into why it's happening. And then one of the other reasons why people, very few companies get into it, is about the financial impact of correcting it. So things I don't know, I don't have to do anything about it. But if I know that there is a problem, then I need to address the problem. Otherwise, you get questioned. So people stay away at the higher level and then not get into deeper evaluation or an assessment of what inequity exists, not just pay, in terms of any decisions that we take in terms of talent. uh, Understanding the equity is important with respect to post decision analysis.
So, again, tying it back to my first question, do you think an organization needs to reach a certain maturity level in their DI journey before they can embark on the pay equity metrics? An organization just starting on it, can they do it, or will it be overwhelming?
It will be overwhelming for organization just starting, because I always believe that no, you need to enable the organization before you start measuring it. Otherwise, measure and baseline it, but don't communicate it in terms of pay equity and things like that. But if you were to take, I mean, first of all, help the organization understand what is pay equity, enable managers to take equitable decisions, and then look at and facilitate it with policies that would be equitable through the life cycle of the employees, at the time of joining, at the time of promotions, at the time of annual pay increase, etc., and then start looking at analyzing pay equity. Otherwise, it's more like there are a lot of random actions which is getting collated together to get it could be a good starting point, but not an actionable one. The actionable one will be more in terms of after we have made investments.
Thanks, Potan. With that, I think we've come to the end of the session. And thank you, audience, for making the session really engaging. And please watch the space for our next topic, the Thought Leadership series. With that, thank you so much and have a wonderful day ahead. Bye.
Thank you very much.